All right, this is take 3. If this doesn't work, I have to assume that something's wrong. My recording mechanism keeps crashing. All right, this is an effort to respond to a prompt on Twitter from the Portal DAO, where they were suggesting that they wanted to assign an NFT to someone in association with an inquiry into a question around something like regenerative civilization. Benita Roy responded with a series of tweets exploring the distinction that she's making between civilization, which she frames as being, in essence, anti-life or extractive, and therefore in contradiction to the notion regenerative. And then another kind of human form called culture, which she proposes is intrinsically wholesome and therefore able to be in proper relationship with the notion of regeneration. Okay. So in contemplating this, one, I felt pulled into it. So there's something there that seems strong and important enough for me to apply the effort to record 3 different videos. 2, as I endeavored to respond in the form, the medium of Twitter, I noticed a performative contradiction. Okay, what does that mean? The essence of the concept, the essence of the thing that is being pointed to with the words regenerative civilization, which may not be properly named regenerative civilization, but the essence of the thing cannot be properly contemplated from a third-person perspective, meaning if you're standing separate from the thing and endeavoring to express and articulate it entirely from the point of view of a third-person observer outside of it, this is actually in alignment with or participating in the essence of the thing that Benita is pointing to with the term civilization or separateness. So in this case, and in an effort or to properly contemplate the inquiry, also to do the thing, to actually be participating in the thing itself, while also contemplating it, and in this case, endeavoring to express something about it. 2, in the same thing, the same moment, awareness, the notion of the distinction between an unconscious and a conscious relationship with the thing. To be aware of this third-person distinction and to notice that that's meaningful, for example. Also, to notice the role that the medium plays in the relationship, that Twitter is not the proper medium. There's something about the form of the medium that is intrinsic to the quality or the characteristic of the relationship. In this case, I moved to Substack and noticed that that wasn't working either. Then I thought about it and said to myself, this maybe should be actually a recorded dialogue with Benita. And then I settled on this format, which is interesting. And I found myself bifurcating 2 things. One was the notion of dialogue, or specifically dialogos. And of course, in dialogos, we have a distinction from the prompt that the NFT should in fact not be assigned to a person or to, say, a 20th century identity, but rather to the inquiry itself, the dialogos itself, which is in the center. So now I'm in the moment of dialogos with Benita and with Portal DAO and Joe Brewer and the many other people who gathered around that inquiry. And the NFT is associated with the center, with the essence of the inquiry itself. And then in a very subtle way, the dialogos here is playing with the space between culture and civilization. And so to do it in the form of a video, which in some sense, Benita isn't participating in, but in the sense of hyper conversation, everyone is participating in, opens up the space of civilization culture and the space of dialogos. Okay, so that's where I landed. So here I am. All right, so given that context, always noticing the first person and third person. Civilization, culture, regenerative. So Joe Brewer pointed out or emphasized that the thing that Benita is talking about in the context of civilization can be very well held with the metaphor and the specific technology of plow. Okay. And this pulls me deeper into the inquiry. I think that we can go 2 or 3 levels deeper, and we need to make the distinction proper. What is plow? What does plow do? What does plow mean? Well, a plow is a kind of device, a technology developed by humans. And what it does is it decontextualizes, I'll go into more concreteness in a second, it decontextualizes for the purpose of producing a short-term optimization of certain characteristics desired by humans in exchange for the long-term death of the complex system that it's in relationship with. It's actually a pretty potent symbol. What do I mean? Well, what a plow does, of course, is it goes down. It cuts into the earth. And it does roughly 2 things. One is it pulls rich soil from deep, from underneath, and brings it to the surface. And the second thing is it breaks structures, roots, rhizomes, etc. And what this does is it produces an upwelling of a nutrient base and a downgrading of things that would get in the way of very specific plant root structures, which enables a increase in the reliability, the regularity, and the productivity of planting. The point, agriculture. We can plant plants in plowed soil, and it's easier and more generative and more productive for a while. But the other thing it does, decontextualizes. It actually breaks up the complex system of the microbiome and the rhizomatic connections that actually are what make the soil nutritive in the first place. And by disrupting them, kills them. And so if you continue to plow, you will eventually, in fact, kill your soil, which civilization has done quite successfully. So that's, of course, a thing. But more importantly, it's actually a very powerful metaphor. And I want to point more deeply. So let's take it all the way back, well before the plow. I'm now sort of sitting in the moment of hand axe, and a long history of hand axe operating in the mode of the unconscious, meaning evolutionary process, napping hand axes for maybe hundreds of thousands or even longer, hundreds of thousands of years or even longer, with relatively little change in what's happening. But there's a moment at which sapiens, Homo sapiens has the capacity to make this move in a very fundamental way, which is to say, to take the object of experience and to decontextualize, to abstract it from the present experience, from the rock in front of me, and from the action of napping, and to begin to isolate principles, to alchemically distill the essence of what is being done and how it is being done to produce particulars. Things like sharpness, things like hardness, angle, kind of rock, right? A whole conceptual landscape, which can only happen in the modality of mind, virtual, of simulation. And when that's done, produces a dramatic increase in the capacity to achieve the desired result. We can now produce vastly more effective hand axes. And of course, if you run that tape forward, you can produce, I don't know, nanoscale cutting machines or something like that. Okay, now here's an inquiry. So that's the deep point, right? I want to go all the way down to that point. This human, the intrinsic contradiction or the intrinsic separateness, something new in nature. Homo sapiens, right? The human body, which is immersed in evolutionary process, immersed directly in complex reality as an intrinsic part of it and not separate from it. And the capacity of mind, or whatever we want to call it, the virtual, to do this move, to identify singularities in some kind of conceptual space, some kind of virtual space, and allow a radical increase in the ability to shape experience towards particulars, in this case, desired ends. Okay. Which they gives rise to things like plows. That's a very profound distinction. And it's the root, I would say, of the distinction that Benita is making between civilization and culture. Now, what I want to do is I want to then reframe. I would propose that this question, regenerative civilization, is actually a very powerful koan, that it's not strictly improper to describe something regenerative civilization, and it's not strictly a mapping to culture, but rather there's a movement from what I'm going to call culture one to culture two. And that movement is, in fact, the movement of the arc of dysgenic or destructive or whatever civilization to regenerative civilization. Okay, let's see how I do this right. In the arc of civilization, I want to describe it as an arc like this, which, by the way, I would propose we're sort of nearing the top of that arc, the apex, the singular point at which it shifts from one to another. Unconscious civilization and conscious civilization. Unconscious civilization would be characterized by the deployment of evolutionary process in relationship with this capacity of isolation, of the alchemical distillation of essence. And this is trouble, because this new capacity is highly asymmetric with the other characteristics of wholeness of our natural environment. That's kind of the point. So if we operate according to the ordinary behaviors that got us there, by the way, culture 1.0, as if we operate according to unconscious evolutionary process, which has been held in a certain bounding of symmetry, so that there was no real capacity to break that symmetry. We, Homo, were evolving in the context of the niche of our environment in culture 1.0, bound by things like orality, and the distance of voice in terms of space and time. And if I speak to you and there's no other way of recording it, then it really evaporates. Only those who hear it hear it. And once they've heard it, it's gone. It's in their memory and no further. It's bounded by number. And only so many people can really operate in the context of culture 1.0. This is the Dunbar construct. And the characteristics of that, right? The characteristics of that boundedness of orality and space, time, and Dunbar, even Homo sapiens in that envelope are able to operate still within the limitations of symmetry with our natural environment. We don't break things badly. We break things. We set fires in ways that nature wasn't able to do beforehand. But what I would say is that it's still relatively well held. It's not intrinsically terminal. Okay. But this tool, this capacity for alchemical distillation of essence and optimization in the virtual technology gives rise to an asymmetry. And the problem of that asymmetry is that as it climbs the evolutionary exploration in the unconscious mode, it produces a greater and greater asymmetry. And so I've plowed my soil, and I'm noticing that my soil is starting to die. And basically one of two things happens. Either it dies, or I use more technology to kick the can down the road. And that could be any number of possible things. Let's say I fertilize it, or I build a new technique of crop rotation. I can buy some time. I can expand the zone of the space between the local optimum and the global optimum, and the death that happens when I shortchange the global for the local. Unconscious civilization. So my civilization grows, and I'm able to achieve an increase in capacity. Now I'm inserting things like the tainter curve, the tainter dynamic, by continuing to deploy, in some sense recklessly, but more specifically unconsciously, as if I'm operating in an ordinary evolutionary process, but continue to deploy this virtuality, this tool of optimization of in mind, and I expand capacity. But in this arc of the unconscious, I will eventually reach some end. I will eventually kill the soil. And as others have said, I think Michelle Bowens said quite nicely, there's a very particular terminal endpoint, which is when you've expanded to encompass the whole of nature, the whole world, and you have kind of depleted the metaphorical whole of all possible versions of soil. I'm using soil metaphorically now to represent things like oceans and nutrient gradients and biodiversity, right? All these sort of reservoirs of complexity, these reservoirs of connectedness and wholesomeness and aliveness. And as you kick the can down the road by means of unconscious use of technology, you're simply deploying a deeper and deeper and deeper extraction vector until you've reached the limits to that, right? Which is, of course, where we are. All right. Now the move. Is it intrinsically the case? Is it simply the case that the use of the virtual is always just broken? Is that just bad news? And we simply should put to the side that capacity and retrograde from being Homo sapiens to being simply Homo? I suspect not. And I would suspect that someone like Tyson Yunkaporta would in fact point out that that obviously is not the case, that there is something about the ability to be consciously in relationship with this power that allows us to bring it back into continuity, back into a symmetric relationship. This is the whole notion of custodial species. That the challenge is not so much culture versus civilization per se, though I'm not at all arguing with that distinction, but with the right relationship between the energy or the thing of civilization and the energy and thing of culture. And I'm going to name that now conscious civilization, and the end point of conscious civilization, which I will now call culture 2.0. If you'd like, by the way, in many ways, I'm simply recapitulating Game Indigenous, Game A, and Game B. Conscious civilization is what we're doing right now. Conscious civilization is that which happens when we are simultaneously operating modalities of technology, operating in modalities of the virtual, that third person piece, but now beginning to notice the responsibility, both the capacity and necessity of responsibility that allows us to begin to step back into wholesomeness, wholeness of relationship with the whole of life, which is an arc. It's a movement away from the consequences and behaviors and intuitions of this third person separateness, unconscious evolutionary process, into a new thing, which, if we'd like, we can call conscious evolutionary process. Noticing that conscious evolutionary process actually does have something like an endpoint, culture 2.0, which is the reintegration of sapiens into something new, some new kind of relationality that is able to operate with a level of consciousness and unconsciousness as an intrinsic, deeply balanced and deeply wholesome. It's less of a thing that we have to work hard at doing and more of a thing that we're very good at doing, call it naturally. Right? Human nature now includes this intrinsically. Greg Henriquez, I would say, has identified this as being the location in the joint point of culture space, whereby, my language, there's a portal pathway to a new kind of thing, in the same way that in behavior space, animal behavior space, there was a location behavior space that was a portal pathway to culture. In the context of culture space, there's a portal pathway to this new kind of thing, which I'll just call culture 2.0. Okay, well, hallelujah, that worked. Can you believe it? iMovie crashes, but Zoom call recording works fine. Okay, so that's the end of that arc. Now here's the other piece of the inquiry that dropped in, which I couldn't help but play with, and that has to do with the fact that we're talking about an NFT. And I find this very intriguing, obviously, being me. The NFT that's being proposed has a very powerful thing to it. I mentioned earlier that it should properly be in relationship with the dialogos itself, not as an object, not as a noun, but as a kind of pointer that the NFT, I would say, represents the dialogos. Or I'll say a different language. The NFT represents the scenius. Ah, nice, right? I did a thing about that. So check this out. Scenius. Scenius has to do with three elements. One is something like a not yet realized possibility that is very potent or latent in the realm of potentiality. It sort of wants to be realized. It's almost touching ground. It's touching ground lightly. That is attracting to itself people, humans, sentients at least, who can perceive it at the level of potentiality that it's at and are called to bring that potentiality into deeper realization. Thus a scene, right? The scene is the conjunction of those three movements, the possibility moving through potentiality, those who are called to it in an increasingly rich community, and the increasing realization of that possibility, which has a feedback loop, right? And thus is the scene. The scene is that which is named by or tokenized by the NFT. Okay, so we've proposed, we've invoked a scene. The scene is the inquiry or the calling of the question, regenerative civilization. In many ways, we can dispense with the English words because we're now in a transcendent space. There's an inquiry. That inquiry is calling us. It is a scene. Those of us who are called to it are participating in that scene. We, by virtue of our work, our effort, our expression, our artistry, to the degree to which we have it, are embodying the possibility of that scene into increasing reality, which of course makes it more legible, more perceivable by a broader community, which attracts a broader community into it, the embodiment of the scene itself. The NFT is that whole embodiment of the scene itself, one aspect of which, one sort of moment of legibility, is the symbolon of some artistry, some singular element. Could be anything, could be music, could be a JPEG, doesn't matter. I mean, it can't be anything. It has to be very particular, but that particular area is not bound to some extrinsic construct that allows the vibe, the essence, the aesthetic quality of the scene to be felt. It's sort of like the codex of the scene, that as we explore it, what we notice as we continue to return back to the artistry is that the symbolon resonates properly and orients our collective sort of transcendent design capacity more and more deeply into the scene. And I symbolon here very specifically in the kind of the icon sensibility. Token, right? I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I want to dispense with the foolishness of our contemporary culture, that which is operating in the unconscious civilization frame. I want to be conscious. I want to begin to build the language of culture 2.0 properly. Token, right? It's everything in unconscious civilization is upside down. Betoken, right? The word, the etymology of the word, the meaning of the thing that is being pointed to by the symbol, token, is to speak solemnly. That's what it means to token, to betoken. A very precise responsibility. Only a very few members of a community are afforded the responsibility of betokening, right? The Adamic capacity to properly name something. This is a real thing, right? Betoken. Non-fungible. Well, we can dispense with that because if we are in right side upland, we already recognize that the essence of token is intrinsically non-fungible. And that other kind of thing, fungibility, is a whole different problem. All right, so we're now just tokening. That's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to establish something like the token or tokenza that are properly naming the scene, the transcendent essence of the inquiry, the question that is calling us forth, and in service to which we are participating in the dialogos. All right, that's what I got.